So I've started recording here, and I'll
Okay.
let the people
Have you enabled sharing for me?
I've made you the co-host. Yep.
Okay, great. This presentation's hot off the presses.
Excellent. Okay. All right, awesome. We'll get started here. All right. So for our listeners here, my name is Lydia. I'm the AmeriCorps Education Team Leader at Borough Land Trust, and thanks for tuning in to our Curious by Nature event. This time we're talking about social vulnerability in natural disasters. I have Dr. Eric Tate here, Associate Professor of Geographical and Sustainability Sciences at the University of Iowa. He uses social vulnerability models to study how natural disasters disproportionately affect some populations more than others. And this is going to be important because traditional models don't identify locations of most vulnerable groups, and consequently, disaster relief aid does not get distributed to those vulnerable groups. So welcome, Dr. Eric Tate. I'll let you introduce yourself, and we'll go on from there.
All right, thank you, Lydia. It's like we have an intimate group tonight, so I'm going to talk, but I'm going to show a few slides in the beginning, but feel free to interrupt with any questions as they go along the way, okay? Let me go ahead and share. All right. You see that? It's all right? All right.
Yep, I can see it.
So my name's Eric Tate. I'm a geographer at the University of Iowa. And but I haven't always been a geographer. I was a civil engineer. I went to Rice University in Houston. And afterwards, I worked for the Environmental Protection Agency. So I actually did this kind of stuff, collecting soil samples, and we send them off to a lab and see how hazardous the site is, and we write a report. Some of the worst got to the Superfund program. I went back to graduate school, got a master's degree in water resources engineering, and then I went back into consulting again for another 6 or 7 years. We built this big model for FEMA that estimates flood damage to houses and infrastructure. And then I realized that there's a lot more to flood disasters than impacts to stuff. Like the reason we care is because it impacts to people. So I went back and got my PhD, but not in engineering this time, in geography. And I went to the University of South Carolina and I studied social vulnerability modeling. Essentially, can we have a better understanding of like who's the most vulnerable and where? So these are kind of maps that I made in my dissertation studies and still make some of those even now. So what does this have to do? What does social vulnerability have to do with natural disasters? So this term natural disasters is kind of a bit of a misnomer because most disasters aren't entirely natural. They're only a disaster because they impact us and the stuff, how we organize our society. And as a principal response mechanism, the US policy has presidential disaster declarations. And once this occurs, it unlocks all these federal resources. So this is a map of Iowa showing a bunch of presidential disaster declarations related to floods. Okay, and we could have them for drought and for heat and for other extreme hazards as well. Okay, so a lot more PDDs in the northeast of Iowa over the years, at least over the last generation. There's a bunch of different disaster programs that are used. So sometimes you hear in the news about disaster assistance that's been released. That can be a little bit confusing. Normally they're talking about, I think, probably individual assistance, which is what flows to households. But there's these other dimensions too, this public assistance, which is mainly for like repair of infrastructure. There's small business administration loans. And so if you don't meet an income threshold, here's this table on the right is showing these income thresholds. then instead of giving you money, you can apply for a loan, which is up to 200, I think $200,000 for if you're a homeowner, 40,000 if you're a renter for your stuff. If you do meet the income threshold, you can be eligible for up to $35,000 in assistance. But the average amount is actually less than $1,000. So it's supposed to be meeting uninsured and underinsured and uninsured needs, but those small amounts don't really do a whole lot. Then there's a hazard mitigation grant program. This is like looking forward, trying to reduce a lot impacts from future stuff. So I think University of Iowa got some HMGP money after the 2008 floods to like make sure the steam tunnels that go under the river are like, really fortified, for example. Okay, they're thinking about the next series flood. All right, so all these disaster programs and all these disaster declarations, it sounds like we should be in good shape, but these programs often fall short. Sometimes they're not even approved. So the headline in the top left was the Marshalltown tornado, where it's denied federal disaster assistance. And so what happens to the folks that are underinsured or uninsured who suffered tornado impacts? More recently, we had the derecho, right? In beginning, federal assistance was denied, this individual assistance for a lot of homeowners. So it's FEMA basically says their mantra is safe, sanitary, and secure. The money that they give is not meant to make people whole. It's meant to just be, so you're safe enough just to survive and maybe get back into your house. But it often falls short. We saw this in the derecho. Particularly some populations within Cedar Rapids area had more serious and persistent impacts, in patterns start to emerge. It's folks that are low-income households that don't have enough insurance, renters more so than homeowners, but homeowners that are underinsured could be really vulnerable, and particular vulnerabilities when it comes to refugees that may have language difficulties. Some have come from war-torn areas where you don't want to go into shelter systems. So distrust, and that comes over here, right? So I have a colleague who works in Cedar Rapids, and she's still saying that there's still families that still haven't had their homes repaired, that the kids haven't been made whole. It's a real challenge. So what is social vulnerability then? It's essentially that people that are living in chronically challenged lifestyles, right, just to get by, and then a disaster comes and they get knocked over, right? And what we tend to see disaster after disaster is that some population groups tend to have more frequent impacts, right? Income, gender, race, ethnicity, health, age, home ownership status, immigration, if you're a recent arrival, all of these. And so this chart shows some impacts that can result from this, right? And why is this occurs? Because the way we set up society, essentially, we hear all the times about sort of the wealth gaps and racial discrimination and xenophobia and these kinds of things. They manifest in terms of outsized vulnerability to disasters. So I'm a social vulnerability researcher. So I ask all sorts of different questions. I'm a geographer. I use mapping. So I build spatial indicators. So numerical values that can be mapped across space. This is showing a social vulnerability map in Sarasota, Florida, with the blue showing places that are lower vulnerability, the red places that are higher vulnerability. So we can build these maps and answer questions like, who are the most vulnerable? Where are they? How equitable is disaster assistance? If you combine social vulnerability and physical vulnerability, what does that tell you? So here's an example of using spatial indicators to map social vulnerability. So the general approach is you can find characteristics like these that are associated with vulnerable populations. Now, the key thing to understand is like, not everybody who's poor is vulnerable, and not everybody who is chronically ill is vulnerable. These are population level things, right? So if you look across a neighborhood or a community or state, these are the patterns that are persistent. So we can get census variables that represent these dimensions. We can build a model, and this is a model looking at the United States, showing that the places of highest social vulnerability are in the desert Southwest, the Rio Grande Valley, portions of the upper Midwest Plains, and a large swath across the southeastern United States. Okay. Now, so this gets back to this question of how does social vulnerability compare with physical vulnerability? So build a social vulnerability map, then I can build a physical vulnerability map of flooding. So this is showing where places where flood exposure is super high. And what we see is the lower Mississippi River Valley, places along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, the Central California Valley, the Red River of the North, and parts along the Missouri River that we should be familiar with Iowa had really huge flooding just a couple of years ago along the Missouri River. Now, so these are different dimensions of social vulnerability, but using GIS mapping, we can put them together. We can try and understand where it's high in both dimensions. And so here's an example map of that from a study we recently did. And so this is a cluster map, essentially showing where are places where physical vulnerability, flood exposure, and social vulnerability are both high, and that's the red. The places where physical vulnerability is high, but social vulnerability is low is the blue, dark blue, right? And so I'm most interested in the places that are red, places, multiple dimensions of social vulnerability. So then the question is, okay, this helps us understand where these places are, but who lives there, right? How are these populations different from elsewhere? And what we found is that if you compare the places that are red to everywhere else, some of the characteristics that pop out are the leading top one is mobile homes. So there's 156% more mobile homes. The percentage of mobile homes is 156% higher in these high areas of high flood exposure and social vulnerability. Okay. The Asian population is 150% lower. The Black population is 103% higher, right? And so what you're starting to see is like dimensions of housing and race and income are some of the leading characteristics associated with heightened social vulnerability. So what can we do with that understanding? A lot of times people think that vulnerability is just about income. But our analysis, at least for flooding, is showing that it's much deeper than that. So if you have a finer grain understanding of what makes people vulnerable, then you can use that to prioritize distribution of resources based on need. So trying to understand like, what are the needs of people that inhabit mobile homes? And this resource distribution is based on multiple vulnerabilities, the social and the flood exposure. We can start to assess who benefits from recovery funding. Where is this disaster assistance going? Is it going to places that have high populations in these groups or not? If not, then it's mismatched. We're giving resources to people that may not need it the most. And then, one of the big things with the federal government, state governments, city governments is trying to integrate social equity into hazard programs and planning. And so, how do you do that? What do you need to look for? So having research that's empirically based, it's based on data and observations can help guide the way we build programs. That's the general idea, thinking about social vulnerability in natural disasters. And there's really no time to waste because we got all these problems now, but climate-related hazards are getting more severe. The trends, they're increasing, losses are increasing over the last 50 years, bigger increases in recent decades. And even these increases are still happening even when you take out like population gains and wealth gains. The losses are still going up. Here's a map of billion-dollar disasters from 2020. And NOAA just started recording these maybe about 10 years ago, and you'd have like, 9 or 10, and then a few years later, like 12 and 14, and then last year we had 22 different billion-dollar weather disasters. So what happens when you're having rising disaster impacts with socially vulnerable populations? Things are likely to become even more challenging. Okay, so that's kind of a primer on what I do and why it's important. I think it's important. So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think, this is incredibly important, like you said, going forward, and something that a lot of people don't think about. I don't think they necessarily think about that there is kind of this disconnect with disaster relief. Can you kind of explain, maybe, I think you maybe touched on this in the beginning, but currently how disaster relief money is kind of, how do they decide where that goes? So traditional models look at, what kind of factors?
Um, well, it's actually based on a process, this presidential disaster declaration process. So what makes something a disaster? The general idea is that the community that's affected, they don't have the resource, they don't have the wherewithal to deal with it, right? So say, you go home and the house next door to you is burning, right? We actually can deal with that as a city. We have a fire department and they can respond, right? Now, what if the whole street's burning? Okay. Maybe you need to call in, fire resources from Cedar Rapids or whatever to help. Okay. We can handle that sort of still locally or regionally. What happens if like the whole neighborhood is on fire, right? Or half the city's on fire? Now, we're going to need more resources than that. And so there's sort of an assessment process, a damage assessment process that the governor's office goes through. If the impacts are high enough, then the governor submits a report to FEMA. FEMA evaluates it, and then the president has to make a call. Is this, will they declare a presidentially or declare a disaster or not? And when they do, there's a law that basically that's when money starts flowing. And it flows to these programs like public assistance and individual assistance and the SBA loan program and the hazard mitigation grant program. Each one of these programs is meant to help in a different part of disaster recovery.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Did anyone in the viewers here have a question about Dr. Eric Tate's presentation?
Yeah, I do, Lydia, if I can ask my question. Excellent. Dr. Tate, thank you. This was fascinating to kind of learn more about this. A couple of questions. One, I know that there are some areas of the country where there's just now kind of repeat disasters. So I'm thinking like California with fire, parts of the Gulf region where hurricanes are just repeatedly striking. I was wondering if you've looked at if there's starting to be this kind of concentration effect where you have individuals that have been impacted by a number of storms that they've been able to leave. So those that are wealthy enough have the ability to move because of their job or whatever. Are they leaving, therefore like concentrating some of these other groups where they don't have the funds, they don't have the ability to leave their jobs, and therefore they're kind of concentrating in these areas that have repeat disasters?
That's an interesting question. So I mean, this is happening worldwide. Sort of climate-driven relocations, climate-driven migration. Okay. So you tend to see the most of it with these really massive storms. Like Katrina drove a lot of people out of New Orleans and they moved to Houston permanently. They're not coming back, right? But there's also this other effect, like what you're talking about, sort of these more frequent, maybe smaller ones, where some people are able to leave and some aren't. Kind of depends where you are, because There are some places that are really hazard prone and becoming even more so that are actually attracting people. So you can think about sort of like coastal Florida, where
Mm.
living near the coast is seen as an amenity. Okay. And so housing prices, in these places are still going up, even though it's really hazard prone. In other places, you're seeing kind of what you're talking about, and people, they don't have a choice because they don't have the resources to just pick up and go. They don't have like a job where they can work virtually, for example. Now you have to be there, right? So yeah, there's some inequities there for sure. Right now, there's a big movement. It's called managed retreat. That people are trying to think about planning, particularly for these hazard-prone areas, like moving entire towns or neighborhoods in a planned fashion. But there's a whole lot of questions around that, like where are they going to go? Who's going to pay for it? There's a lot of challenges associated with that, but there's a lot of places, really low-lying areas, especially. There's a lot of this talk about like sea level rise. People aren't going to have any choice. I mean, there's not going to be, where their houses are right now, it's going to be underwater. So it's going to be a really big challenge going forward.
And a second question I had, if I can go for one more, on the, I think it was the second to last slide that shows like who lives in the more vulnerable areas. I can't remember the name of the slide exactly, but it showed like the plus minus, that one.
Oops, what did I just do? Let's try that again.
Number 10.
Okay. What is happening here?
There we
Okay.
go. Yeah, so one thing I found really interesting here is unemployment rate itself isn't listed on here. So you have employment in extractive industries, so
Yeah.
that makes sense. But just like standard unemployment rate wasn't listed. I was wondering if that was an indicator with regards to those that are living in the most vulnerable places.
I think it was. I mean, what I'm showing you is the top, what is it, 10, 12, something like that. We put 29 different indicators into this model,
Mm.
and these are the ones with the biggest disparities. Let me just check that real quick. That's an excellent question.
Yeah, I just noticed with the it was very specific with extractive industries, but with everything else, like you normally see unemployment and poverty, unemployment
Yes,
and
civilian
incorporated.
unemployment. That was one of our indicators for sure.
Hmm,
It didn't make the top of the list.
interesting.
Is,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, is age part of it at all? For example, seniors?
It is. Let me give me a second here, and I can share with you guys if I can find it here.
Yeah, that full list would be so the number one being mobile homes. I think it's kind of I don't know what the right word would be, but people think like when a tornado hits, you hear taking out a mobile home park, or if there's a flooding event, it's obviously a major impact with mobile homes. That's fascinating to me that there's that big of a percent change for that indicator.
Yeah, here's a, oops, a presentation I gave. Here, let me get out of here. Stop share. To the Iowa Water Conference
Mm.
about a month ago. Let me see. Oh, it's not open. All right. is, sorry. Here we go.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Here's the full list.
Hmm.
So this is the high clusters. The table I was showing you, we merged places that are high clusters, so high flood exposure surrounded by high social vulnerability. We merged that with the high-low clusters, which are high flood exposure surrounded by low vulnerability. Essentially, we're trying to isolate these places that had a high level of flooding, essentially. And because I think you can learn a lot from places that have high flooding and high social vulnerability, but you can also learn from places that have high flooding and low social vulnerability. Because what kinds of resources are being deployed to protect those places where there's an absence of or less social vulnerability. So this is just the high clusters. I guess civilian unemployment came out 11th in just the red, but when you compare the red and the dark blue, it fell out of the top.
Hmm.
But these are all the 29 variables. Like the couple ones in red here, I put here because these are often variables that people think about when they think about vulnerability. So age, you had a question, Lydia, I think, and renters, per capita income. So they didn't come out on the list at the top, but this is just with respect to flood exposure. Now, renters may experience lots of challenges with disaster recovery, like trying to navigate programs, or find that programs aren't really well suited for them. So just because an indicator doesn't come up high in terms of who's in the floodplain, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the group of people who are most affected by disasters. Because disasters are our making as well. The disasters also like when we decide to what conditions we decide to give aid, and then when we do that, how much aid is given, and when among that aid that's given, who's getting it, and to what extent does that money that's received meet their needs. So there's all sorts of questions that lead from hazards, extreme hazards, to disasters. But here's your full list. One of the things one more thing I point out to you is look at number 9, the median housing value. Places in these high clusters had a median value of about 119,000. Everywhere else, the average is it's $150,000 difference in housing value, which is massive. That's one of the things that surprised me the most, also with like mobile homes coming up on top. So there's big differences. Most families, the bulk of their wealth is tied up in their house. So these places that are highly vulnerable also don't have a whole lot of wealth.
And then how different is this list? Because you mentioned it's for flood exposure. Is it dramatically different than a list that would be prepared in a similar fashion for those exposed to fire, those exposed to non-flood related disasters? Is there I'm guessing it's not completely different, but are there some targets that normally fall towards the top?
That's an excellent question. And there, so the stuff I'm just showing you is a paper we just published a few months ago. Like there's not that, this is still at the forefront of what we're learning. So what's tend to happen is people build these social vulnerability models. They came out probably around 15 years ago. And they would do the initial models were based on studies of all disasters. So hurricanes, wildfire, tornado. And they pick these characteristics and they build these models. And then they apply the models to every disaster, in every aspect of a disaster. So the last few years, my group and colleagues, we've been asking a lot like, okay, well, how does who is vulnerable change depending on the hazard type? How does it change based on if you're thinking about before the disaster or after the disaster? If you're thinking about flood exposure or impacts with disaster recovery? And sort of that finer grained questions around these, they haven't been done yet. This is a problem because like the Biden administration is putting a ton of like focus into equity, and they're talking about like social justice and climate. but we just don't have the tools yet to know, to say like, okay, if we devote an extra $1 billion, where's the best place for that to be allocated to help the people the most? We don't know.
How do researchers such as yourself, how do you keep this data current and continue to collect data like this that will make the models accurate?
Well, the benefit is like, I'm not really collecting in this data, I'm just sort of modeling it. So the demographic data on population comes from the US Census. So, the important things for me is like, are people participating in the census or not? And some people don't want to. Sometimes the Census Bureau just misses people. The problem is there's like some chronic groups that they miss, and they tend to be aligned with many of the groups that are the most vulnerable. So there's like findings decades ago about chronic undercounting of minority, um, people with low English proficiency. The homeless aren't even counted at all. They're probably the most vulnerable.
Right,
So
totally. I mean, if you are living in poverty and you're holding down 2, 3 jobs, you don't have time to fill out a silly census survey. It may seem silly to them, or you're not home when they come by. So I totally can see how that happens.
it also has to do with how the census is done. Like
Mhm.
they try and count everybody, but they don't measure all these characteristics from everybody. They use sampling. So, they may ask like 1 out of every 6 or 7 households about your race and ethnicity or your income. And then they use statistical methods to make those numbers represent the entire population. And doing that sort of extrapolation, it becomes really difficult when those numbers are small overall. Okay. So if you take something like gender, okay, say we just say male and female, right? Both of these groups are a large percentage of the population. So if you find the gender count in a small part of the area that you're surveying, you can extrapolate that and feel pretty good, right? But say you're trying to measure, I don't know, the Black population in Iowa City, and you try and extrapolate that. It's a small number to begin with, so your errors are bigger. And so it really matters, like if you get those counts in your original survey, and if you're undercounting from the beginning, then the numbers are going to be gone off. So I try and keep current with census data, comes out every year.
Yeah.
And this kind of flood data is just now, it wasn't available 3 years ago. So there's a lot more data available now. It's going to be a benefit for research.
So are these models currently being used to determine areas that are going to be pretty vulnerable?
Some places use them, and that's recent. The challenge is we don't really know if the models are predictive. Or here's the fundamental question. If the places that you model and you say these are the most vulnerable, do they actually turn out to be the most vulnerable in disasters? And this field is newer, so there's been some studies done on that, but not enough. So we don't know. But yet there's this huge need to have this data-driven decision making.
Gotcha. So it has not been something used by developers and city planners, but as of now, so we're still kind of waiting on the verdict as far
Well,
as.
typically what what we've cared about in disasters is stuff, right? How much damage is there to a house or to a hospital or to a bridge?
Yeah.
Okay. And what's the monetary equivalent of that for insurance or, budgeting for repair? Or even like how many people are impacted. So, we'll report on like how many people were injured or how many people died, for example. But we don't generally ask who
Right.
is injured, whose houses were destroyed, who had to, leave their homes? How long? Who's not insured? This question of who is more of a recent thing. And I'm not, we wouldn't say we care about it yet, even based on where we put our focus and how we allocate money and how our policies are set up. We're still really, really focused on stuff.
So even in a place like down in New Orleans where, disasters like hurricanes are, have been absolutely devastating. So it's still not something that's, kind of in the policy as far as the aid needs to go to those vulnerable groups. So is that kind of accurate still in New Orleans?
Well, I mean, you gotta remember, like, most disaster aid is federal.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter what New Orleans says about disaster assistance. It's going to be based on federal policies. And so right now, the federal laws for disbursement of disaster relief, they don't really focus on any of that stuff. It's more just like, was the capacity of the community exceeded? It flows, but depending on these programs. So some of them have income thresholds, but I think some of these programs are explicitly prohibited from collecting data on race, for example, even though like race and ethnicity repeatedly been shown to be, important markers of, differences in outcomes
Yeah,
and impacts. We see that in COVID for sure.
that's really interesting. They're not allowed to take that into consideration. I'm very surprised by that.
And actually, I had a kind of follow-up question with that. Sorry to interrupt. So I'm curious though, and with regards to like the census data, your thoughts on whether or not this idea of individuals who are undocumented, if that information should have been collected, because I'm sure that's a population that is incredibly vulnerable. Yet we're not going to have any information about numbers of undocumented individuals. On the flip side, if it was required, there's all sorts of issues that pop up there, and fewer people might be willing, and you would have skewed data because people may or may not answer truthfully. So I'm curious as to your thoughts, just as an individual using this data, which route would be preferred?
Well, I mean, ideally we have data on everybody if our principal goal is relieving vulnerability, but that's not really been the case in our country. Like, our principal goal with that kind of information might be deporting people,
Right.
right? Or, doing workplace raids, or trying to make sure that we're not spending, social service or health dollars on people that are undocumented. So there's a tremendous amount of fear and distrust. So I don't think that these groups would participate anyways. But you've pinpointed another really vulnerable group that they're in the shadows for the most part. We don't know. They may be unwilling to come into shelters because of fear of being identified, not eligible for disaster assistance programs, regardless of whether there's a presidential disaster declaration or not, ineligible for all these loan programs, ineligible for almost everything. So what happens with these folks? It was a huge impact in Harvey, and because the undocumented population of Houston is quite large. It's a real problem. It's going to get worse.
Yeah, I don't think that was on your list of indicators, undocumented
Right.
percentages of our population, probably
Because
because
there's no
that data-
variable.
Yeah,
There's no variable
exactly.
for the census for that.
Interesting.
That was actually a huge court battle with the Trump administration. They were trying to change the census rules to collect information on undocumented individuals. But then other people were saying, well, what's going to result is going to really depress the count. And the point of, the reason the census is in the Constitution is because we need an accurate count for, making our district lines for the House. So we want to make sure that we get an accurate count of people. And so it was that one. It was a little complicated. Like, there's some not true, untruths told from the Treasury Department who runs the census. So it got dismissed. They were prohibited from trying to ask that question.
What was I gonna say? So, I mean, what's it, it's kind of like a gloomy situation here. I mean, what's it gonna take for this to become common practice, this type of modeling? And I know that's kind of a loaded question, but is there, you know, a big push happening, or, you know, what's kind of the future of this?
I mean, being used more and more because people like, if you just rely on economic, valuations and where stuff is damaged. I mean, okay, consider this. You've got, so I came from South Carolina. Charleston is one of the most hazardous places in the country. It's an earthquake prone region. There's hurricanes that come through, there's flooding, there's lots of chemical plants, there's tornadoes, everything. So you got a house on the beach, it's worth $1 million. Okay. And that house just gets wrecked by a hurricane. Then a little bit inland, you've got 7 houses that are each worth 100,000. They all get wrecked. So you got $1 million of damage in one house, $700,000 with 7 people elsewhere. How should we prioritize where we spend our money for disaster recovery? Right now, if we do it based on dollar damage, we're going to focus on where the higher losses are. So wealthier neighborhoods, where there's more economic damage, where benefit cost analysis will be more favorable. Things are weighted in those directions. So it's a problem right now. The current way we do things isn't great, but it's kind of emblematic of our whole system about equity, this question of equity, right? And prioritizing the most vulnerable. And you see it, it's not just the COVID pandemic, you see it in like educational outcomes and housing and criminal justice and, right? You just go across all these institutions, education, degree attainment. There's, we got racial, income, ethnic disparities. And so that's just how our country's set up right now. And I think until if we're willing to really get into those, then I think a lot of these disparities with vulnerability to disasters will disappear. So the problem's a lot deeper than modeling and trying to find numbers to help guide disaster decision making.
Yeah, definitely. That's why this is so hard. Yeah, we all know that our government is not, necessarily quite fair in a lot of ways, and there's all kinds of disparities. Out of curiosity, have you looked at combining, have you looked at climate predictions at all in trying to figure out, the most successful models?
So the climate predictions are best for the physical dimensions of hazards.
Mm.
So like the flood model, the flood data that I showed you, I mapped, that's for 2020. But the same group that, that supply that data, they have models for 2035 and 2050. So we could do the same analysis using those. We don't have population projections. We have challenges with like representing all these populations accurately right now. Trying to project into the future is really challenging. So you can build future models with physical aspects. So what's future flood risk? What's future wildfire risk? They use these global models that look at like what's the expected change in temperature and humidity and rainfall and precipitation, all this stuff, wind patterns. And they can downscale these and make really good hazard maps, or at least, best guesses.
Yeah.
Can't do that with population.
Yeah, and I believe a lot of climate models are unpredictable themselves, as the nature of those kinds of things.
Well, I would say like everything is unpredictable.
Yeah.
So this is actually something that kind of got me. There's this big was it like a fight or a controversy? So go back to like the 2012 election. President Obama is going up for re-election. He's facing off against Mitt Romney, and so the election's in November. In October 1, they released the last unemployment numbers that they were going to release. And what it showed was the unemployment went from like, I think it was like 8.3 down to 7.9. And there's all this, people were saying, oh, they cooked the books. They wanted to get it under 8%, right? And then what you do is you go and you start looking into these data, and they'll have like, for the unemployment models, they'll say like the unemployment figures are like 250,000 people plus or minus 120,000 or something, right? The uncertainty bounds on these are huge. They just report the median value and they say that's the unemployment rate. But if you look at unemployment rate and like consumer, satisfaction, all these things, like there's these huge uncertainties, but we just report the median. We don't talk about all the uncertainties for these models. We talk about climate. We say, oh, it's all uncertain. We can't make any decisions. What can we do? But yeah, we do that all the time right now.
Yeah.
I think it's just an excuse not to do anything.
That's very true. That's a great point. That's a great point. I don't think many people know that. So, we have, let's see, 10 ish, 10, 12 minutes. So, we can take questions from the audience, but also as a kind of a conclusion, what's next in your steps here? What's next for you as a researcher?
So one of the challenges in doing this work is that we get census data on population, but it's built into these areas. Okay. So, we got like states and we got counties, and then the Census Bureau has these geographical areas below counties called census tracts. And then below that, there's block groups, but essentially they're like aggregations of like, it's like a neighborhood. So I would have like the count of elderly people in each neighborhood, or the count of people, civilian unemployment by neighborhood. But what we don't know, so you can do sort of models of where vulnerability is highest, but we can't track that to individuals. So if you get data from like these disaster programs, like which house was affected, but we can't tie that to population data because we only have that at the neighborhood level. So it's challenging to state that we know what we know, because we're modeling at this aggregated scale when really it's a phenomenon that happens at the household level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, so I started some conversations with the Census Bureau, and apparently they invited me to be a part of this program where I have to like do this background check and get this special stored status where I can get individual level census data. Like if I violate that, I can go to jail or something. Like they're really, you don't want to like release individual information about characteristics, but it can allow us to do modeling that then we can report in aggregated units. So no one's privacy will be violated, but they'll be more accurate. So I'm looking forward to doing that in the coming year or 2 or 3, because they want their data to be used in ways that make sense. They understand demographics and modeling. They don't understand hazards, and I understand hazards a lot. I know enough about the demographic stuff, but obviously they're the experts at it. So we're going to be a partner. We're going to be partners over the next few years.
That's fantastic. You were able to kind of get that permission. Yeah, hope you stay out of jail and
Yeah.
and do everything by the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Any questions from our audience here? I know we kind of covered quite a bit of information and some topics that probably are new to people, but we'd love to take any questions and in our last 5-7 minutes here.
I just wanted to say thank you for not the presentation, but just for working on this. Obviously, a very critical field that is probably fairly underrepresented itself within the research world. And so as we kind of move into this space where disasters are probably going to be happening more often and in more populated areas, I'm sure this work will be useful at not only saving lives, but making sure that people's lives are not as impacted by these events. So thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have good job security for a while.
For better or worse, right?
Yeah,
You're not gonna solve the problem, that's for sure.
yeah.
Out of curiosity, are you seeing, I know you probably have undergrads working for you. Are you seeing more interest in this topic specifically? Are you seeing more people come up to you and be like, hey, can I work on this? Can I work with you?
I think most people don't know it's a thing, actually.
Oh, but
You
yeah.
know, I mean, what do you think about when you hear about a really severe flood disaster? I mean, what comes to mind? Big flood disaster, go.
Houses destroyed,
Okay.
roads destroyed,
Mhm,
people without homes.
mhm. You turn on the TV, what are you gonna see?
I don't know. I don't watch TV. Jason, what do you think?
Flooded streets. You ever
Yep.
see those aerial shots of
Mhm,
Yeah.
people out in canoes around houses that are
mhm.
partially submerged, any dams that have broken, a lot of infrastructure issues.
Yep.
Yeah.
How do you portray human suffering? How do you portray income-based disparities?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a hard graphic for the nightly news to throw up there.
Uh-huh.
It's when people don't understand statistics to start with, and you start talking about modeling
Mhm,
or human suffering. It's a pretty tough call.
I think, and I think more, more often we feel bad for the dog, the video of the dog that's, stuck in the flood or stuck on a house, and we're
mhm,
more inclined to care about that than the people, which is
mhm.
interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I got into geography in the first place, because for me it was like realizing that why do we care about floods? Like some flood happens in the middle of nowhere, we don't care for the most part. We care because it hits people. So if we care about people, then it's really confounding problem to me. Like I don't fully understand it. Like why aren't we people centric in the way we think about disasters? But
Yeah, it's
I
like
think
when
it's go ahead.
the forest fires in Alaska, there's millions of acres that
Hmm.
burn that no one ever talks about because it's not impacting people. And then
Hmm.
you have these 200-acre fires in California that devastate millions of people sometimes. And yeah,
Hmm.
it's a completely different disaster.
That even then, like the focus is on like what's going to happen with housing markets and the insurance industry, and they're not talking about like what's the level of stress that people are under. They're not talking about like what's the average amount of time that people are out of their home, that they have uncertainty about their schools and their job, you know. But those are like the real concerns of people. It's just
Yeah, I
it's not
absolutely,
sexy, I guess.
yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's fascinating. And, after the flood in Iowa City, we saw that big wall come up around Mayflower, the residence
Hmm.
hall, right? But I didn't see anything that was going to protect people, people who are going to be displaced, people who can be injured. I didn't see any of that. And in Cedar Rapids, I used to live in Cedar Rapids, there's walls being built around, businesses or the factory or whatever, but, nothing for the people really. And we saw that when the derecho hit, it was absolutely horrible. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for talking about this. I find your research, incredibly important and fascinating to think about. And I hope the future is bright when it comes to, uh, figuring out these models and using these models in a more effective and efficient way. And thank you so much for talking about this.
Yeah.
All right, and that is the conclusion of our Curious by Nature event. Thank you, Dr. Eric Tate. Wonderful. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you. Oh, and we'll have this recording up on our YouTube probably this week or next week. So you can watch it again.
Thank you.
Good night.